Now I like to introduce Torkel Klingberg for you. Very welcome. Torkel comes from Karolinska Institute. So you're the only one actually who's coming from Stockholm. Department of Neuroscience. I should know very well. Anyway, you are actually the first researcher actually were able to show us that children with disability can improve their working memory by training. And that means to keep in mind what you actually is doing. Anyway, today you will share your knowledge with us about talking about working memory training as a clinical tool to improve working memory and attention in everyday life. Very welcome.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to thank Ann-Kristin Eliasson and Hans Forsberg for inviting me here. This is a wonderful conference. It's an honor to be here, really. So I'm going to talk about a different type of training of cognitive functions and working memory. I'll start with saying a few words about working memory and the neural basis, then describe working memory training, and then going into the clinical aspects, transfer to attention, and the potential clinical relevance. So working memory is ability to keep in mind information for a short period of time. And it's been used by a number of different researchers in different research fields. So it was first proposed to describe deficits in patients with frontal lobe lesions by the neurosurgeon Carl Pribram. So they said that we would like to speak of the memory we use for the execution of our plans as a kind of quick access working memory. Thank you. But most well known is the cognitive psychologist Alan Badley, who describes working memory as the temporary storage and manipulation of the information necessary for such complex cognitive tasks as language comprehension, learning, and reasoning. And then from a totally different field comes the neurophysiologist studying how single neurons behave in monkeys when they do working memory tasks. And one of the most prominent researchers here was Patricia Goldman-Rakic, describing the kind of working memory that she studied as keeping information online for a brief period of time, usually on the scale of seconds, and more generally as the capacity to guide behavior by representations of stimuli rather than by the stimuli themselves. And so the descriptions from the cognitive psychologist and from the neuroscientists is something that we are trying to combine now in the field of cognitive neuroscience. And working memory keeps to be a very relevant field. Working memory capacity, how much information you can keep in your working memory. It correlates with ability to pay attention, with non-verbal reasoning ability, with mathematical ability and reading. And we see impairments in working memory in many groups of individuals. In ADHD, children born prematurely, in children after cancer treatment, and after traumatic brain injury. So what we would like, ideally, of course, is to help all these children as well as other groups, and that this help would transfer to all kinds of fields. Just a few words about the basic neuroscience of working memory. It's been first studied in monkeys, and this is a description of a task. A monkey looks ahead, then a cue is presented here to the right. The monkey should remember the position of that cue during a delay and then respond by looking at the position where they saw the cue. And then the activity of neurons are recorded. And what people saw was that there is sustained activity in prefrontal neurons and parietal neurons during the time when the monkey is keeping information in mind. So this is online activity, keeping the information online. And moreover, it's been discovered that different cells code for different information. So if you're remembering a cue at 90 degrees on a circle, it's the 90-degree neuron that fires and marks the position of the cue. If we go to humans, it is more complex. This is a simplified view. So what you see to the left is when you retain verbal information in working memory, and to the right visuospatial. So there are differences. When you retain verbal information, it's more of temporal and language areas involved. And it's also different if you're just repeating some verbal information or if you're doing some more complex manipulation, what is referred to working memory as opposed to short-term memory. So when you do more complex verbal tasks, you see additional areas that are required. For visuospatial working memory, that distinction is not as clear. Instead, you see activation of visual areas. But again, you see the same network. So there are differences as well as similarities between different tasks. And this is the basis why you would also hope that you could get transfer. If you transfer on a working memory task using these areas, you could partly use better performance in these areas also for other tasks. So this could be the basis for transfer. So what's this network doing? One way to describe it is cognitive control, but it seems like it's tightly connected to spatial coding, because we use space in visuospatial working memory, we use it for many cognitive tasks and also for attention, spatially selective attention. But that we'll go back to that. Here we can see the role of space. Again, here activations during visuospatial tasks. And what you can see here is that if you analyze the brain activity in the parietal cortex here, you can actually read out the information of working memory. So present a cue like this, and this is the brain activity that we can read out. So based on the brain activity, you can actually see what kind of information is kept in mind. So this is a kind of a map that can be used then also for spatial attention. So this overlap is illustrated, for example, in this task. Here subjects performed either a visuospatial working memory task or a spatial attention task. And you can see the overlap in this brain here. The overlap is either light blue or black areas. And as you can see, a lot of the same areas in the interparietal sulcus and in the frontal lobe are used for both attention and working memory. And this link between attention and working memory is also evident from purely psychological studies or behavioral studies. So, for example, you can see that in children with ADHD, they have an impaired working memory. These working memory deficits seems to be specifically linked to inattention rather than hyperactivity or impulsivity. It's the inattention problem that predicts poor academic performance in the same way as working memory deficits predict academic performance. So these deficits in ADHD and other patient groups was previously regarded as something that you couldn't do very much about. But then we started to see if we can actually, by training, intensive training, improve working memory capacity, and that it would also spill over or transfer to the inattention in ADHD. So this was studies that I started here at Karolinska Institutet together with Hans Forsberg and others. This method that we used, it was mainly visuospatial tasks. Here's an example. We made a game-like design of this. It was subsequently developed with the company Cogmed, so this is sometimes called Cogmed Working Memory Training. In 2008, Susanne Jeggi and colleagues used another method. They used training with a dual end-back task, which is illustrated here. So here the subjects should remember the position of cues, but also remember letters presented at the same time and match each item with the two items previously. They focused mainly on IQ, so then this idea was born that you could be smarter by doing working memory training, while we focused more on the clinical part, attention, and studied children with ADHD. But there are many other groups that have proposed different methods for training working memory. Sometimes analysis is done lumping all these methods together, and sometimes, as you will see and I will present later, I'll show data only for the method that we developed, which is also the method that has been most used in research. So this method, it is simply repeated performance with feedback. So they do these working memory tasks on a computer, but there's no strategy instructions. It's adaptive difficulty, close to capacity limit. So when they get better at this, the difficulty increases all the time. It's mainly visuospatial tasks because we see that the deficit is larger for visuospatial tasks in ADHD, and also because it's more closely linked to spatial attention. It's pretty intense and extensive. It's about 35 minutes per day, 5 days a week for 5 weeks. And I should mention too that I have no association to Cogmed or Pearson or anything else here. This is the second study we did. It was a multi-center study. We randomized children to treatment, which is this working memory training, or to a control group. And the control group used similar looking software, but with easy trials. So if kids in the treatment group, they were trying to remember like 4 or 5 or 6 items, children in the control group remembered and responded to 2 items, so easier trials. And then we saw, when we tested with different kinds of working memory tasks, so working memory tasks that were not part of the training program, we saw in the control group here in white that compared to pre-basement or pre-intervention training, they just improved a little bit. But the green, the treatment group, improved about 15% in their capacity, and they retained this gain at the follow-up 3 months later. Subsequently, the same method has been used in slightly different population and different tasks. And we can see that it's not only visuospatial working memory tasks, but also what's called complex working memory tasks, where we see improvement. We see cross-modal transfer. So even if you exclusively train on visuospatial tasks, you can see the transfer to verbal working memory tasks. And you can see transfer to more complex working memory tasks, such as remembering an instruction. And I think it's a quite nice task. It's a very ecologically valid task because it shows why it would be good to have a better working memory, because remembering plans or instructions is what you do all day long. Now there's been an explosion in studies of working memory training, and we're also starting to see some meta-analysis, and most of those combine all types of working memory training. And if we look here, we have 4 meta-analyses only from last year. So this shows the effect in for transfer to other working memory tasks. And they are pretty consistent, showing roughly 0.6 standard deviations of improvement. So that means that this is effect size means how much the training group improves after subtracting away how much the control group improves. So now we know that working memory can be improved. So this is in itself a bit of a paradigm shift. Next question is, what is it good for? I see 2 goals or aims with this. The first is that it's an experimental tool to study brain plasticity associated with higher cognitive functions. how does the brain change from cognitive stimulation? And the other is as a potentially useful intervention in the clinic or possibly in school. I'll just say a few words about the neuroscience. This slide summarizes studies done during roughly the last 12 to 15 years with different types of methods. So in green here you can see results from neuroimaging studies in humans. And most consistently we see changes in activity in parietal and prefrontal areas. So it's higher association areas. It's not the hippocampus, it's not sensory areas, but higher association areas where we can see a change in brain activity. The second is that we can see changes in the communication between these regions, what's called functional connectivity. The probability that area A will be activated by area B. And this is interesting because it creates more stable networks. And in red is the results from a number of simulation studies with people use computer models to simulate brain networks to see what kind of changes would result in a better network. And there we can see that if you strengthen the connectivity, you get a more stable network with higher capacity. In blue here is the results from a number of studies looking at non-human primates, macaque monkeys, doing working memory training, where they can see that the increase in neurons, the firing rate of the neurons increased during the delay after training. And they also see more neurons with delay activity, so that more neurons are devoted to keeping information in mind. And another theme is the relationship to striatum and dopamine. So with positron emission tomography, it's been shown that there are changes in dopamine release in the striatum, and a number of genetic studies also show that variability in genes related to dopaminergic transmission affect how much children improve when they do this training. So this indicates that the dopamine system is very important for the plasticity here. So that's the neuroscience of training. Now let's look at the second aim here, the potentially usefulness as an intervention. As I said in the beginning of the presentation, working memory is associated with many different functions: attention, IQ, mathematics, and reading. So I will not go into these areas. I will focus on the area where I think there is most evidence and most consistent evidence, and that's the improvement of attention in everyday life. I'll show some examples of how this has been studied, and then I'll give a summary also of different studies. So here is the 2005 study I showed before. We measured DSM or ADHD symptoms using the questions from the DSM-4 for ADHD. And we could see that in the training group, there was roughly a decrease in inattentive symptoms with 1 standard deviations, while the control group that played the easy computer games, they improved by roughly 0.3. So that means that we have an effect size of roughly 0.7. As you can see, there was not as much improvement, and at follow-up, none for hyperactivity impulsivity. And this also makes sense because of what I said earlier. The neuroscience of attention and working memory is very similar. Here's another study from another group looking at working memory training in old and young healthy adults. So they had 50 young adults, 50 older adults. Again, randomized, blinded, controlled study. They had a number of cognitive tasks where they could show improvement in cognitive functions, but they also measured function in everyday life, attention in everyday life, with this questionnaire, cognitive failure questionnaire. And here is what's happening to the old training group. they have, this is how much inattentive symptoms they have from the start. And this is questions like, does it happen often that you walk into a room and forgot why you walked in there? Or do you have to reread the titles or the sentences in a newspaper because you didn't pay attention? And this is symptoms we all have, more or less. And as you can see here, after training, they improved. At follow-up, they retained the improvement. Here's the young group. They have less symptoms to begin with and improved significantly, while there was no significant change here in the control group. So this is very hopeful. We see this not only in the school-age children, but also in older adults. This is a study which was interesting because of a measure they used. They used, instead of questionnaires, something called restricted academic setting task. A child is placed in a classroom-like environment. They have some papers. They're supposed to do some math exercises. And then there are some toys around them. And then they're being filmed. And the film clips are then analyzed by observers who don't know the grouping, whether the child belongs to the treatment group or to the active control group that, again, got these easy tasks. And what they could show was that overall there's a significant effect of attentive behavior. And it's pretty subtle things, like whether the child looks away, like the kid here on the picture, looks away from what they're supposed to do, or looks actually at the task at hand. So they showed also that this kind of measure was more sensitive than asking the teacher, is the child attentive, which also makes sense because it's difficult to pick up this kind of subtle behavior if you have a class of 35 or 30 or 25 children in front of you. Here's another study from last year, children again with ADHD, and they showed significant improvement using the brief scale of behavioral ratings of executive functions. Here's a fifth study here, and they studied children with acute lymphoblastic leukemia or a brain tumor that had been treated for this. And these children, they get problems with attention, with working memory, and there's not so many alternatives for them. But what they found was that they had a significant effect of this compared to the control group for ratings of inattention and executive functions, with pretty good effect size of around 0.7, 0.8. A colleague and me recently did a meta-analysis of different studies, specifically looking at the cognitive working memory training. Studies that had used some kind of measurement or questionnaire for everyday attention. And overall, we saw an effect size of 0.4, which is highly significant. And this includes then children born prematurely and children, cancer survivors, etc. At follow-up, there's still very few studies that have long-term follow-up, but the effect was still significant, although slightly smaller here, 0.3. Another meta-analysis was published by Samuel Cortese, and they had another approach. First of all, they look at all kinds of working memory training, but they only look at ADHD. Furthermore, they looked in two different analyses. First, the measures that were reported as the main outcome measures, and then they found an effect size of 0.47. So inattentive symptoms decreased by half a standard deviation compared to the control group. Then they also looked at raters that were further away from the kids. So if the training was done in the home, they asked the teacher for inattentive symptoms. So the logic here was that they would be more blinded, but again, possibly less sensitive too. So there are pros and cons about that. And then they found an effect size of 0.3. So in this case, that was just shy of significance because of the low power here. But I think it's rather remarkable that these meta-analyses point consistently to effect sizes of around 0.3, 0.4, 0.5. And that is pretty good. If you'd have a drug that affected everyday functioning with an effect size of 0.3, it would be a blockbuster. First evidence in this case is the effect of SSRI. These are blockbusters. They have an effect size of 0.3, and that is for severe depression. If you look at moderate depression, it's even lower. Let's look at methylphenidate. We know it decreases hyperactivity, but what about cognition? If you measure working memory, the effect size is around 0.26. What about other non-pharmacological alternatives? One is physical activity. So aerobic activity, there is a lot of research about that, but if you look at purely cognitive effects, the effects are not huge. And this is the immediate effect, so that the hours directly after training. So I think that we should be pretty happy with this. I think in the future we will learn more about the different subpopulations. It might benefit some more than others. I think that for some groups we will need longer training periods. For example, children with low IQ and Down syndrome, there's studies going on where they roughly double the amount of training in order to get similar effects. So to conclude, working memory training improves working memory, which is a good thing in itself, for example, for remembering instructions. But it also improves attention in everyday life with an effect size of around 0.4. And I think the coming years we will learn more about the effect for mathematics and other academic abilities. For the future, I think we need better measures of attention, such as this restricted academic setting task that I was describing. It's not good enough with these questionnaires. We need larger populations in training studies. If we expect effect sizes of around 0.4, 0.5, it's not enough with group sizes of 20. We need 100 in each group. This is something that people have learned in genetics, in pharmacological studies, and we need to learn that too in the field of training. I think in the future we will see combined and individualized training. This was only working memory training. What if you could combine it with other types of training, training of inhibitory functions, training of nonverbal reasoning, etc. And I think there will be a role for neuroscience. Neuroscience has been part from the start to understand the mechanisms. I think that we might be able to use neuroscience to predict outcome of training or what kind of individualized training we should apply. And I think that neuroscience also will help us to create even more effective interventions in the future. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Torkel, for doing this exciting research. You have been able to brought knowledge from basic science into clinical practice, and that's really something extraordinary, isn't it? Thank you very much.
Thank you.